Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Joshua Henkin to discuss his new novel, Morningside Heights, June's #1 Indie Next Pick, published by our friends at Pantheon. Joshua Henkin is the author of the novels Swimming Across the Hudson, a Los Angeles Times notable book, Matrimony, a New York Times notable book, and The World Without You, winner of the 2012 Edward Lewis Wallant Award for American Jewish Fiction and a finalist for the 2012 National Jewish Book Award. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and directs the MFA program in fiction writing at Brooklyn College. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Lily King. Lily is the New York Times best-selling author of 5 novels, including most recently Writers and Lovers and Euphoria. Her work has won numerous prizes and awards, including the Kirkus Prize, the New England Book Award for Fiction, the Maine Book Award for Fiction, a MacDowell Fellowship, a Whiting Award, and she has been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Penn Hemingway Award. Wow. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Morningside Heights from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome, welcome.
Hi. Thank you, Christina. Hi, Josh.
Hey, Lily.
How are you?
I'm good. So nice to be here with you on the screen.
That's so fun. I kind of wish it were in person, but
Totally. But it is what it is.
Have you had an in-person event for this book?
I have not yet, although I'm going to have one in a little over a week on the New Jersey shore, where my wife is from. And they have an outdoor space right near the water, so I'm totally psyched about that.
Oh, that is exciting. Well, thank you so much, Books and Books, for having us. It's really
Christina, thank you, Books and Books. So appreciate it.
So huge congratulations on this book. I just loved it. I loved it. It is so understandable why it's the #1 Indie Next pick. It's so moving. It's so real. It's such a stunning portrait of a family kind of in a slow-mo, long-term crisis. And you just you just nail everything, basically. I am wondering, I'm just going to launch in. I'm wondering, of course, about the first flicker of the flame of the idea, where you were, what you saw in your mind, what you thought. Did you take a note? Walk me through that.
Yeah. So, it took me 8 years to write the book, and I wrote 3,000 pages. So it's kind of hard to remember. There's so many missteps along the way. But based on like Spence, my father was a professor at Columbia, and he got Alzheimer's much later in life than Spence did in his late 80s, but, didn't have a good time. And he was still teaching at Columbia because he was teaching well past when he should have. Wow. And my mother, when my dad was declining, went to a class at the Jewish Community Center in Manhattan for caregivers. And my mother is very much not a consorting with strangers kind of person. She consorts with the people she wants to consort with. And so I just was interested in what had happened in her life that made her feel like she'd be happy to talk to strangers who really had nothing in common with her except for the fact that they were all caregivers. And so the novel started off as a very long short story that took place really entirely at the JCC. But pretty soon I realized that wasn't what I was interested in, that I was interested in this family over many years. And so, by draft 8 or 9, the JCC was gone. But that was really the launch pad, for the book.
Wow. And would you kind of pick your mother's brain about that? I mean, were you like, so what happened today? JCC?
So So my dad died in 2010. So I can't remember exactly when my mom was going to this class. Let's say it was like in 2007 or 8. So I was still on an earlier book. So and yeah, I guess I wasn't really. I was less interested in sort of like what. Maybe that's why the JCC part didn't work out. But I was less really interested in what was happening at the JCC than in. Yeah, then I mean, I guess the book is really deeply about Prue. I mean, it is Spence who has Alzheimer's, but I tell my grad students that don't write a story about a ball rolling down a hill, because if you write a story about a ball rolling down a hill, it's going to roll down a hill, and that's kind of the difficulty of writing a novel about someone with Alzheimer's, is that if it's realist fiction as this is, and if it's taking place today as this one is, then the medicine of it is not. There's no tension there. I mean, unfortunately, that the person is going to decline. And so I was really not interested in writing about what it's like to be someone who has Alzheimer's. I mean, we're in Spence's point of view sometimes, but really never while he's declining. And I guess I'm not a performative writer in that sort of, like, I didn't want to ventriloquize that. Yeah. I really wanted to see what it was like for the other characters, especially Prue, but all the other characters. And so, I was interested in a woman like Prue who, goes to Yale and starts grad school at Columbia and is very accomplished and kind of just, gives up everything to hitch her star to, this great man.
Yeah.
And the great man is no longer great. And what does that do to her? I mean, you know what it does to him, but in some ways, because he's not so lucid, he's less aware of it than she is. And so in a weird way, it's harder for her, I think. So anyhow, yeah.
Much harder for her.
Yeah.
I really want to get into Prue, but first I just have to go back to the 3,000 pages.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sure people are like to really dwell on that because that is
the
pages. But I'm wondering, when you say 3,000 pages, you're really talking about?
It's not a figure of speech. It's
3,000 separate pages. Or are you talking about like a number of draft? I mean, when you say the 8th draft, the JCC isn't there anymore.
Yeah.
Did you? I'm curious about in terms of, did you write and then kind of find the story within, or did you write and write, like dig a tunnel and then you finally saw light on the other side? Like how does that work?
Yeah, I think probably a little closer to the second. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say I wrote 3,000 pages, but I do think narratively. So it's not like I don't know how you go. I mean, different people go about it differently in terms of revision. I mean, I'm extremely compulsive on the sentence level, and my inclination is to revise as soon as I can, but I feel like that's a mistake, at least for me, because then I have like a really beautiful scene that doesn't belong in the book and I get attached to it. So I need to kind of like get out of the way of my compulsiveness. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the way to do that is to just, is just to write a lot of pages. And I sometimes write by hand because my handwriting is sloppy. I think when you put it up on the screen, at least for me, the compulsion is to make it neat because it looks neat. But since my handwriting is horrible,
exactly.
I do all sorts of tricks to try to get out of my instinctive tendency to revise immediately. But yeah, when I say 3,000 pages, I mean, I don't just write. I mean, I do know writers who I'm going to write, this scene that would probably take place somewhere in the middle of the book. And I can't do that because I do feel like the relationship between character and narrative is symbiotic, and we create our own stories and are created by them. Mm-hmm. And so I at least have to think that I'm starting at the beginning, and I'm always wrong. But that's different from not thinking that you're right when you're. In other words, yeah, the book ends up nowhere where I thought it would, but I do write with narrative in mind. Like this happens and this happens and that happens. But like as one example, I mean, in an earlier draft of the book, it took hundreds of pages for Spence to get diagnosed, and it really wasn't working because the reader knows that the reader knows exactly what's wrong.
Yeah.
And so that kind of dramatic irony isn't interesting. It's too thick. You just wait for the character to discover what the reader already knows, and it made Prue seem more obtuse than she really was. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of streamlined the beginning in a lot of ways.
I loved that. I appreciated that so much because, when you read something in the flap or you hear about it, you know it's coming, and you just want to plunge into it. I was really pleased that really by the, first chapter, right? We figured it all.
Yeah, you find out. Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, yes, I agree. And I mean, we never. I shouldn't say we. You think I would learn from the things that I tell my students, but I don't always. I'm always telling them that like big reveal novels tend to be problematic. The plot is not the same as plot device. That a story is not a Rubik's cube. Like all those things that we rely on as kind of tricks. And I feel like in general, it's like, just tell your story. And there'll be surprise along the way.
Yeah.
I always tell my students that, and then I don't listen to it. So then it takes me a long time to write a book. So.
Well, what I really admired about when we do find out, that something's not right with Spence, it's not a big reveal. It's not a big dramatic, like, he falls down a flight of stairs, or he's standing in his class and he can't remember who Shakespeare is, or, there's so many ways in which you could have just, I don't know. I'm not saying it would be necessarily cheap or anything, but just maybe unnecessarily dramatic, and instead it's the difference between the word festive and formal, and then the next page, it's, he wants to catch the mouse in their house with his bare hands. And those things on another person would be completely normal, I mean, but for you, but Prue knows that this is not normal, Prue, it's all like Prue knows,
Absolutely. And I think that you're right, Lily, and I think the reader knows too. I mean, for better or worse, I kind of feel like that the small things are what are most revealing. So I'm like, there are bigger things. I mean, there are certain like sort of moments, when Spence gets fired and Prue has to deal with the department chair, or when he goes in for the mini mental exam and he can't count backwards. I went through that with my father, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But I agree with you. I'm more interested in the mouse scene, the scene where like Spence is trying to catch a mouse with his own two hands. I mean, I guess for people who haven't read the book, it's a little hard to put it in context. But Spence is a guy. Spence is like my father. He basically is a guy who like begrudgingly accepts that he has a body, but kind of wishes that he really didn't have one. And so, yeah, I mean, so what's really hard for him.
Don't you have that feeling sometimes?
I do. Yes, I do. I do sometimes. Not as much as Spence does or as my father does, but yeah, for sure, sometimes. But it's like what's really hard for Spence is that he can't finish his book. But that's too hard for him to go. He can't go there. So instead, this guy who would never be interested in catching a mouse with his own two hands, he kind of displaces it on that. And so he's like running after a mouse, with a letter opener. And so it's kind of funny and heartbreaking. But I agree. I feel like those small moments, and I find that in your work too, Lily, that I feel like the small moments are what most revealing.
It's what I care about. Yeah. I mean, because they, that's what you live most of the time,
Right.
Would you ever want to read for,
sure, I'll read
a page or two?
Yeah, I'll read for a couple minutes. So I think what I'll do is I will read two very, very short sections. One short and another one super short. And the first one is from when Prue and Spence meet, when she's his graduate student at Columbia. And then the second one, just to give people a little context. So part of what happened with those 3,000 pages is that in early drafts, I didn't have this character named Arlo. And for those of you who haven't read the book, so Spence was previously married before he met Prue. It was a short and disastrous marriage. And they had a son, and they split up when Arlo was 8 months old. His mother is a hippie, and she wants to poop in all 50 states. And so she basically brings Arlo wherever she goes. And Arlo, for a couple of years when he's a teenager, ends up moving in with Spence and Prue and his half-sister Sarah. And it's kind of a disastrous 2 years because Arlo is very smart, but not in the way that Spence wants him to be smart. Spence really sort of bullheaded and thinks that Arlo, who has dyslexia, if only Arlo would study for the SAT, all would be well in the world. So the second section, which I'll read from, is briefly, Arlo gets a job. His father gets him a job in an independent bookstore, the New York City equivalent of Books and Books. And he causes some trouble when he's shelving books. So those will be the two sections, and I'll just read really, really briefly. So the first one is from when, excuse me, when Prue and Spence first meet. Her first day of class, she looked up from her seminar table and saw Spence Robin, her Shakespeare professor, enter the room. He was only 6 years older than she was, but he was the professor, Columbia's rising star. So when she passed him on a snowy afternoon outside chock full of nuts, she glanced away. Are you pretending to be shy, Miss Steiner? That was how he addressed the class, Miss Steiner, Mr. Jones, Mr. Thompson, Miss Dunleavy, doing it with an edge of humor, as if it were a mild joke. We do spend most of our day outside the classroom. It's not like we just materialize in Philosophy Hall. A gale blew past them, and Spence's jacket collar flapped up to his ears. His shock of auburn hair was covered in snow, and Prue was tempted to offer him her hat, but her hat was pink, and if she gave it to him, then she would get covered in snow, and she knew he wouldn't countenance that. They seated themselves in chock full of nuts. The coffee's terrible here, Spence said. Prue agreed, but she was inured to terrible coffee. She drank terrible coffee most days, often from chock full of nuts. Spence removed a packet of peanuts. It was an old habit, he explained, a product of his fast metabolism. He'd been so thin as a boy, he'd been sent to summer camp by the Fresh Air Fund, and when he failed to gain more than a few pounds, he got to stay for an extra 2 weeks. Okay, and then I'll skip a bunch of pages to when Arlo is working at the bookstore, that the job his father got him. He'd moved from hauling and opening boxes to shelving books, and soon books were being discovered in the wrong sections of the store. Someone said, what's the catcher in the rye doing in sports? That's Arlo's section. Arlo denied having shelved the catcher in the rye in sports. Over the next 2 weeks, Virginia Woolf's The Room of One's Own was found in home furnishing, Graham Greene's The Quiet American in spirituality and meditation, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird in nature, Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in science and medicine, and William Burroughs' Naked Lunch in cookbooks. What's the Farewell to Arms doing in military history, someone said. Soon there were more sightings. Jean Reese's Wide Sargasso Sea in marine biology, William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying in Death and Mourning, John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany in religion and spirituality, and George Orwell's Animal Farm in gardening. Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited wasn't with the books at all, but was shelved instead with the bridal magazines. The misshelvings were Arlo's doing, but whether they were mistakes would have been hard for him to say. Some were oversights, others came close to acts of sabotage. Okay, I'll stop.
That's a great scene. That's a great scene. Arlo is really one of my very favorite characters, and I'm actually really surprised that he came late to the 3,000 pages.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Can you tell me about his evolution?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. In almost all of my books, the very big things, even some more so in some of my other books, very big things came really late. I think I was faced just with it's interesting. I mean, people say this is a book about early Alzheimer's, and I suppose it's true, but I actually really think it seems like it's not I mean, there are some sad things, obviously, but it's not a deeply depressing book. I think that's in part because it's about a long marriage. And that's what I'm interested in, is sort of this relationship over the years. But because the Alzheimer's is the engine that's driving the narrative forward, I needed to figure out, I guess it's another version of what I was saying before about rolling a ball down a hill. We want, fiction to defamiliarize the familiar and familiarize the unfamiliar. And I think I was faced with the feeling that, Alzheimer's is sad. You can do that well, or you can do it badly. As is true of anything. Anything can be done well or badly. But I still feel like even if you do that well, I just wanted there to be something more. Mm-hmm. And so everyone else in the book kind of does, broadly speaking, what is expected of them. Mm-hmm. I just said to myself, maybe he had a son, just started to write it. And I don't know, the book really opened up for me. I'm interested in Arlo because he's so angry and because he's so needy. And that combination of things really interests me. So, I don't know. I think, I'm sure from your own work, you basically have to just like not censor yourself and make mistakes.
Yeah.
And, I made a lot of mistakes, but Arlo happened not to have been one of them.
Yeah.
And so you erase the mistakes and you keep the ones that, are not mistakes.
Yeah. And they're not really mistakes. I mean, they get you to where you need to go. You're just exploring, and some things work and some things don't. You can't say why, and you
Absolutely.
just keep moving.
I'm curious about your, I don't know if it's different for you, I know you have a book of stories coming out, but you've written a bunch of novels, but like, what's your revision process like? Do you revise as you go along? Do you plow forward? What do you do?
So I write by hand, and I write pretty much everything in notebooks like I did in high school, until it's done, and then I put it on the computer. And I try, like you said, I try so hard. I mean, when you first start out as a novelist, if you've written short stories, you write like a short story writer, and you want to revise every day. You want to sit down and you want to start just at the beginning again, because you can with a short story. But with a novel, you can. And I learned that, painfully. I learned it. And so I glance at like the last page that I wrote in a notebook, and I just keep moving. I just try to just keep moving as much as I can.
You glance at the last page. I do that too. You glance at the last page just in order to get the voice back and then move forward.
Literally to remember what the heck I wrote the day before. I mean, it's a mystery. Like, at this point, and I also find that I'm a terrible, terrible, terrible judge of my own work in the 24 hours in which I've written it. And so I try so hard, this is what I tell students too when I teach, is that, just to get the judge and the critic out of the room, because it's so useless at that point.
I agree. And I mean, I think that's one of the wonderful things about a novel. And I really do trust myself as a critic with other people's work, but we can never see our own work as close as we see others. But if you're working on a novel and you are not constantly going back, then you can go back 2 years later, and when you're on page 500 and look at page 4, it's as if you hadn't written it. And you can see it much more clearly. Because I know from my own experience, sounds like it's similar to what you're saying, Lily, that I'm often really wrong. Like, I'll remember something, I'll feel like, oh, that was a good scene, that was a bad scene. And often the scene I thought was bad is actually pretty good. The scene I thought was good was bad. So yeah, when you're in that dream state, you're the worst judge of all these things.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah. And you just gotta stay in the dream state and just stay open to whatever comes out, And I love that about handwriting, because I feel the same way. I feel locked in with screen, and I feel it looks too polished too soon, and it doesn't deserve to be that polished. And you're right. You kind of want to make it, so I don't.
I've got to make a computer program that sort of mimics your handwriting, so you can like type it up and have it look really disgusting.
Except I draw a lot in the margins and all that kind of stuff. All right, but I do want to talk a little bit more about Arlo, because I feel a little bit like I'm the Arlo of my family, and and maybe everybody does in some way, but this idea of kind of Arlo feels he feels really guilty for stuff that wasn't his fault, right? And he feels like he's indebted to them, and he wants to pay Prue back. And in fact, I think he was pretty badly treated by them. And what I think is great about Arlo is that, you have Spence, right? Kind of the sun around which everything circles. And then you have Prue very close, and you have Sarah, geographically farther, but emotionally very tied in. And then you have Arlo, who's a planet at a more distant point geographically and emotionally from Spence and the family. And it's just that, for me, that's really what the novel is about. Like, yes, it's about this man's decline, but really it's about how everybody behaves around that. And internally, and also, with each other. So I wondered why, Arlo makes this gesture toward the end to Prue, and I'm curious to know why you thought he did that. Like, I know why I thought he did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just say that, like, why you think he did that is at least as valid as why. In other words, I kind of feel like, as we all know, that we have control of everything until the book is out in the world. But then, readers have different readings, and they might be better readings than the writer has. So I guess what I want to say, one thing, some context for Arlo, I do feel like Arlo was both the character that opened up the book for me, but also provided the biggest structural problem because I needed to evoke, he's gone for, long periods of time.
Mhm.
And so I needed to sort of be able structurally to evoke both his presence and absence.
Mhm.
And I was really struggling with that in a year, whatever, of writing the book. And then I was asked to blurb Joan Silber's, not her most recent novel, but 2 novels ago, Improvement. And I need to thank Joan for this because there was something about the structure of that novel, I can't even remember what it was, that allowed me to crack the nut of the structure of this novel. I feel like, I think that Alice Munro has taught me a lot of things, but one thing she's taught me is that structure is beautiful if it's done right. Like a lot of my students feel like, oh, structure, I got to have a structure, I got to have a plot, but that's actually not true. It is true you have to have one, but it's not true that it's simply that. I think structure done well, like when you tell something, how you layer your scenes, that kind of stuff is a really important aesthetic decision.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a writing digression. But in terms of art, it's interesting. You said Arlo feels guilty. I understand what you're saying. My read on it is slightly different, although he does feel, you said you feel like you're the Arlo in your family. I feel like I'm the Sarah in my family, but Arlo is what I fantasize. In other words, I did well. I did well on my SATs. I put up with my father coming home and quizzing me on vocabulary. I did what was expected of me, and it's probably helped me in certain ways in life. But I have this fantasy of being more rebellious, and I think that Arlo is sort of a certain kind of wish fulfillment on my part. But yeah, I think he does. You're right. He's treated very badly. I think he gets the raw end of the deal in so many ways. And he's resentful for that. I see guilt a little bit, but to the extent that there is guilt, I agree with you. It's kind of unfounded, but I actually see it more in a little different light, which is that he's someone who wants. There's this point. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler for people who haven't read it, but at some point later in the book, Arlo gets hold of an experimental drug, hoping to, cure his father. And there's a sentence that really, in the book, that really, to me, summarizes Arlo's dilemma, which is that he wants to give back his father, give his father his brain back to him. But if he succeeds in doing that, he feels like his father never respected him, and if he gives him back his brain, he will once again not respect him. And I kind of feel like Arlo wants to be the hero. He can't do it on his father's terms.
Yeah.
He needs to do it on his own terms. So his father spits on money, so Arlo's going to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
He's not really cut out for caring for his father and taking care of his father.
Exactly. Yeah.
But he is cut out for being the hero who will get him the drug that will miraculously. So I kind of feel that financial gesture that you're talking about.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, it's certainly generous and unnecessarily generous, but it's also a little bit, I think, of saying, I can buy your apartment for you, and nothing for me because I have a lot of money.
Right.
So I think he is like, I keep referring to various scenes in the book, and then I remember that I cut them. But my favorite scene in the book, by far, is not in the book. But that's another story. But if you want, I can tell you about that scene in a second.
I want to hear that scene.
But there was a moment in the book where Arlo is involved in that. What was that thing? For ALS, where the ice competition, where people poured ice down their backs, for
Yeah.
So there was some reference to that at some point. Arlo is he's about the big splash.
Yeah.
So that I see that as, for me, but I could be wrong, as less about guilt.
Yeah. It's just that he said, Prue says to him, no, we owe you. And he's like, I owe you. And
right.
I'm just like, why? But maybe he doesn't really.
Right. I think you're right. But I think it's a way of his justifying why he. Yeah. I think all of our motivations for something that we do are complicated.
I get that.
Should I tell you about the?
Yeah, please.
So I actually think it's like because we've been talking a bunch about writing. I feel like I always tell my students you have to kill your darling. You got to the scene that you love most, that you built your story around, is often the scene that's the most problematic. You got to get rid of, and this is really true in this book. Like in an earlier version of the book, Spence was an art historian. He was not a Shakespeare scholar, and in so many ways that wasn't working. In part because I know next to nothing, and certainly less than I should, about art history. But also, like Spence is like, as I said before, he doesn't want to have a body. He's deeply aesthetic, and I guess you could have an art historian who's aesthetic, but you think of art history as being about the visual. It just didn't make sense.
Yeah.
So in so many ways, it was wrong.
Yeah.
And people were telling me it was wrong, and I knew it was wrong. But I had this scene. I mean, this entire section of the book is gone now. But there's a scene in an early draft where Spence and Prue go to a family bat mitzvah, and there is at this bat mitzvah the proverbial. This is when Spence is in pretty bad shape, but he hasn't been diagnosed yet. And so there's the proverbial bat mitzvah slideshow, and the father of the bat mitzvah girl is up in front, sort of narrating the bat mitzvah slideshow. And Spence, so Prue loses Spence at some point. She can't find him, and then she looks up, and Spence has like walked up to the front, grabbed the pointer from the bat mitzvah girl's father, and basically with the girl, scuba diving in the Indian Ocean and playing tennis in the Catskills, he conducts an art history lecture. It's totally what he does is totally brilliant and totally incoherent. And if I'm allowed to say so, I think it was a really good scene. I mean, it was like
really good
and poignant. But you know what? I couldn't make him an art historian, and it wasn't worth it to make him an art historian just to say that scene. Even once he wasn't an art historian any longer, I still tried to say the scene.
Yeah.
And I said, gotta kill your darling. So I'm sure you've had I don't know the exact same thing, but you must have had an experience, Lily, where it's like, I love the scene, but it's not working. Haven't you?
I have to say that I don't know. I don't know if I subscribe to the full on kill your darlings theory. Although, probably my work would be better for it if I could, because I cling to my darlings. I just
And you cling to your darlings but is it possible that you cling to them because they actually do belong?
Well, I've never, I haven't gotten. Usually, I have cut huge chunks of novels out. I certainly did that with this last book. I had 60 pages or something, but I needed them to go. And then when I had my character have a whole relationship with this guy, right? And I just cut it all out, and I reduced it. Instead of her saying yes to when he asked her out, she says no.
You're talking about writers and lovers now.
Yeah. Right? And he's the one who has written, I don't know, 11 and a half pages in 3 years or something like that. And anyway, I cut him completely out, and I was so glad to see him go. And that's mostly the feeling I have is just go. Like I feel so liberated to be able to cut things out, but it wasn't working. And so
right, for sure that makes sense. And I guess when you write 3,000 pages, I have plenty of things that just are horrible that I want to cut for sure. And I agree with you, that's totally liberating. But then I feel like occasionally I have something that isn't horrible. But I guess it's sort of, I don't know what you think about this. I guess it relates to the question of sort of like, what the purpose of one's scenes are. And like one thing that, like what I said before, like it took 200 pages or 300 pages for Spence to be diagnosed, and I really needed to streamline that. I mean, part of what was happening was that I had many different scenes that were illustrating the same thing. Illustrating that, Spence was losing his mind. And, again, I see this in my student stories all the time, that they'll move their characters from scene to scene, from place to place. So the scenes are nominally different, but that in a deep way, they're kind of reiterating what's over there.
Right. Yeah.
They're kind of doing the same thing. So I do like to think a lot about narrative and say to myself, like, okay, why is this scene important in the bigger picture. And it's maybe like a less extreme version than Kill Your Darlings, which is more like just, for me at least, just because I feel something is good on a micro level doesn't necessarily mean that it's working on a macro level in terms of pushing the book forward. I don't mean like in a plot kind of way, but just in terms of like, do we understand the character more deeply as a result
Right.
of having read the scene, or do we not? You know, and so yeah.
And can I just get back to structure real quick, because
Yeah.
I know, you know, I read this this interview with you, and you were talking about theme, and somebody was asking you about theme, and you were like, you know, I tell my students, you know, don't focus on theme, because that it can really, you know, it stops you from scene and dialogue and developing characters, and this idea of not thinking about theme and not treating your own novel like, as you said, like a sixth grade book report. And you know, and I completely subscribe to that, and I don't actually hear writers talking about that very much. It really interests me. And when you're talking about structure, I feel a little bit the same way about structure. And I'm wondering, are you thinking about structure the whole time, or is this like eighth draft kind of thing? And when you think of structure, are you thinking about it architecturally? Do you see it in your head? Do you take notes about structure? How are you dealing with that?
Yeah, those are great questions, and I wish I dealt with it better. That's why it takes so long to write for me to write a book. I mean, just the first thing you said, I want to agree with you, agreeing with me. I feel really strongly that, so I had a friend in college who wrote her undergraduate psychology thesis on how adults group objects versus how kids group objects. And the adults group the apple with the banana, and kids group the monkey with the banana. And that's a way of saying that kids are more natural storytellers than adults are. And I think as a fiction writer, we have to teach ourselves to think like a child again, albeit like a smart, sophisticated child. And, you know, I mean, I just feel like it's not that there aren't themes in my books, in your books, in anyone's books. And I'm not saying that one couldn't write thinking about themes, but for me, they're the death of me to think about that. And I spend most of my time, or a lot of my time, with my MFA students, trying to disabuse them of, you know, they'll say things like, I was trying to get this point, this idea across.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, no.
Go, if you want to get an idea across, go be a political speechwriter. Right. You know, go be a rabbi or a priest or a philosopher or a politician. Yeah. Your job as a fiction writer is to make characters jump off the page and tell a story. No more, no, get your characters into trouble, and that's how you discover things. So, so I do feel really strongly that themes are for sixth grade book reports. Not that they're not there, but I'm just not, as a writer, I'm not interested in them. And I think in general, with few exceptions, they're really bad for writers to think about. I mean, Flannery O'Connor said that a fiction writer can't do without a certain measure of stupidity. Some of us come by it naturally. Others have to cultivate it. But I think, like, if you don't come by it naturally, cultivate it, because it's real. I have seen fiction writers who are too smart for their own good. And I actually really believe that if you narrow your gaze, if you try to write a smaller book, you'll write a bigger book.
Exactly.
If you write a bigger book, you'll write a smaller book. Yeah. You narrow your gaze, you focus on your characters, and if you do it well, people will extrapolate whatever they want to extrapolate about the state of American marriage, say. Mm-hmm. But if you want to write a book about the state of American marriage, I think you'll write a novel that's dead on arrival. So, but whatever. I have very strong feelings and strong prejudices about this, but those are my feelings and prejudices. And you know, because we live in an apple banana world, it often takes me a couple of years to convince my MFA students to become monkey banana people. So in terms of structure, I mean, yeah, you know, maybe it's because I went to Jewish day school and I studied Talmud and my dad was a law professor. I actually think really analytically. And so my job is to try to think a little less consciously about structure in the first draft, so that I can let the characters surprise me.
Yeah.
But because I do have an instinctive sense of narrative, I'm always in some general way thinking about it, but I don't map things out, till way, many drafts in. But then I do eventually map things out and say like, so I was reading Rebecca Mackay's Great Believers while I was writing this book, and I think I love that book. And I think I was influenced by the structure of that book in a way that wasn't helpful to me because it's the right structure for her book, the wrong structure for my book. And what I mean by that is, I don't know how many people have read that book, but it alternates narratives between a 1980s AIDS Chicago narrative and a contemporary narrative in which there's a character who's gone missing in Paris. And it basically zigzag, although the Chicago narrative takes up more of the book, the other narrative is a pretty big narrative too, and it kind of bops back and forth. And that worked really well with that book for reasons that are a little complicated to explain, but basically has to do with that it's not as obvious how the characters are connected. And so there's a kind of jigsaw puzzle figuring out the relationship between the two strands. That's interesting and really well done. There's so much in that book is really well done. But to do that for my book, as I was doing originally, it had too much of a pinballing kind of feel. So I'd have like a short chapter of Arlo in New York, and then a chapter when Prue and Spence meet, and then a chapter when Spence is declining, and then there's a big section with Sarah out in LA that really totally with her and her boyfriend and their dog, and that's all gone. But also my way of saying is that I think that I was functioning with too small bites. And so I didn't give the reader enough chance to sort of like settle into a narrative. And because I didn't have that kind of jigsaw puzzle, it was kind of obvious what the connections were. I didn't get the benefit that Rebecca got from her book. And I also had the problems of like, people didn't get to settle in. So at a certain point, I just was able to sort of rearrange things and figure out, that was the challenge, is how to like evoke Arlo's presence and absence at the same. That's a really incoherent answer, but basically, I always kind of think about structure, but I don't think of it in a brass tacks kind of way until I have a whole draft then. And then
it's so funny because it doesn't read like you were trying to figure it out. I mean, it just you got it so that it's just like a seamless thing that just seems so natural, and there seems to be no other way to.
But you must know that from your own. I mean, maybe I'm not saying that every writer's revision process is the same, but so eventually something clicks, or sometimes it doesn't, and then the book doesn't. And sometimes the book doesn't work.
Yeah.
We all that can always happen to any of us. But I always feel like 90% of the actual book gets written in the last year, and it's not because I'm eating bonbons for the rest of the time. It's just because I don't know. With me, I just kind of feel like at some point you figure it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I know that I have to open it up to questions. I've gone way over my time, but I guess there's so many more things I wanted to talk about, but I guess I have to mention, I will not reveal remotely the ending, but there's this last sentence that is just a simple description of a stranger, on the street. And I loved that sentence, and I loved the ending because it seemed to make everything click into place. And, as I tried to write you in an email, that one sentence made so many other things sort of, reverberate. And I was like, oh my God, this is a complete love letter to New York. And I should have known that. I mean, I do have the title right here. I know that you're deeply dealing with place. But there's something about the way you locked it in. It reminded me of reading Colm Toybeen's Brooklyn.
I love Colm Toybeen.
I love him so much. But that book, like, I felt like I didn't understand the beauty and the grandeur of that book until I read the last sentence and I finished it. And I just, I had a moment apart and I was like, oh, like I could just see it. It just came together in this way that it was not coming together as I was reading it. And that wasn't the experience so much with your book. And so I didn't expect this last paragraph sentence to just kind of bring it all together. But I guess I wanted you to comment on the notion of place in this book and what you were thinking about last sentence.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I have a few thoughts about it. So yeah, the New York Times Book Review of the book really cast this book as being a book about New York, and I thought it was a really smart and interesting review, and I think it's a very accurate reading of the book. It's kind of harking back to what I said before. It's not what I was thinking of. In other words, not what I was thinking about, because I don't think about. In other words, yeah, I think place is really important to this book, and I think that if I were a critic reading this book, not having written it, I would think that reading is an excellent reading. Or I might, I think you could even say like the book is about a lost New York that in some way mimics the loss of memory of the characters. I think that's also an accurate description, but I firmly believe that if I set out to write a book about a lost New York that mimics memory, I would have written a bad book. Yeah. So I guess we all have to trust this is what I tell my students. I say, like, don't worry. You're a smart person. You have thoughts. Those thoughts will come through. You don't have to jam them into the book. They'll get there. So yes, I think New York is really important to the book, but to me, it's not important in an abstract way, like, oh, I'm writing about place. And I do think place is a character in this book. Be like, these are characters who've lived in Morningside Heights for so long. Morningside Heights is such a weird, I grew up in Morningside Heights. Now I live in Brooklyn, but I was out of New York for 16 years. I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I lived in Berkeley, California. And in a weird way, those college towns are like Morningside Heights. Despite the fact that Morningside Heights is a huge part of a huge city, it also feels like a college town, and college towns are weird.
Yeah.
And interesting places in so many ways. So I was writing about characters for whom this place was important. Mm-hmm. And so because like my characters are important to me, that place becomes important to me indirectly. But so yes, so through the back door, I feel like place became a character, but I wasn't thinking consciously about New York. What you're talking about at the end, so for those of you who don't have the book with you, so at the end of the book, it's kind of almost like I think it might even be an epilogue. Is it? I think it is. But in any case, whether or not it is, now I'm curious. No, it's not. It's just chapter 47. The narrative of the book is over, and Prue is like is walking from Midtown Manhattan up to Morningside Heights, and she walks past the various establishments she's known for years, and then she remembers the various establishments that are gone, and the last sentence, it's not a spoiler in any way. The last sentence of the book that Lily is talking about, it says, a young woman careened up the block with a license plate around her neck like a charm. And yeah, so I had a number of people.
I just want people to get that. A license plate around her neck like a charm. Just you read it very quickly. So
yeah, sorry. I speak way too
much. Such a great image.
This is the New Yorker in me. I left New York for 16 years, but I still speak too fast. So I've had interestingly, a bunch of independent booksellers have written me, at least 4, I think, but certainly more than just a couple, and said, I was talking with my fellow bookseller, we were trying to figure out like what the meaning was of that last sentence. What the idea, what were you trying to convey? And I guess I come back to the 6th grade book report ideas that it's funny, I do keep I keep notes of things, of lines I hear, images I see, and you can't just shoehorn an image in anywhere. It has to be right. But I once saw a young woman walking along the street with a license plate around her neck. I guess the charm, like a charm, would be what the writer adds to it. But I just remember that image. I was struck by it, and it felt to me when I got to the last sentence of the book, like that was the right image. It was the right feel. I guess someone could say like, Prue's walking down 116th Street, so she's kind of like looking back at her young adulthood. She's now like probably in her late 50s at this point. So, I mean, I guess someone might say, if they were a critic, that what Prue is seeing is a younger version of herself. And maybe, I mean, but that doesn't, I'm really not interested in interpretation. And I guess what I mean by it is like, I feel like for fiction, it has to hit you at an emotional level. And, either the image and the words, and the sound of the words, they're either right. It's like similes and metaphors. A good simile and a good metaphor they have to hit you instantly. If you have to stop and explain it, you've lost it.
Exactly.
So yeah, I guess, I mean, I had that in my storehouse, my repository of images. It felt like the right image and the right tone, just in terms of the sound of the word. I care so much about sound.
Yeah.
At the end of the book, it just felt right.
Yeah, and it was.
Yeah, but I know you're not asking this, but people who think apple banana as opposed to monkey banana, and who think theme as opposed to character, ask questions like, well, what's the meaning? What's the idea? And it's like, I do think there's meaning in fiction, but the story I always come back to, and then I do want to give people a chance to ask questions if they have it. Otherwise, I'd be thrilled to keep talking to you, Lily. But Martin Amis, in his novel, The Information, it's a book about, it's kind of a spoof book about book tours. And there's a writer at the core of it who's written a book that sort of freakishly become a bestseller, unexpected to everyone. He has to go promoting the book, and he's on a radio show with a kind of fatuous host who clearly hasn't read the book, and he says like, "So Bob, what's your book about?" And he says, "Well, it's not about anything. It just is." And the host goes, "Well, no. What's the book about?" No, it's not about anything. It's all 200,000 words of it. If I could have written it in fewer, I would have. And I really firmly believe that about fiction writing. Like we tell, for those of us who have kids, we tell our kids not to read the Cliff Notes, not simply because, you get caught by the teacher or it's cheating, but because we kind of believe that if the Cliff Notes were as good as the book, then then you just have the Cliff Notes. So I really believe that fiction is irreducible. And so, for me, it's all about a feeling. That last line feels tonally, visually like the right last line. Why that is, I don't know. It just does. But when a writer is, I'm sure you've been asked these questions a lot of times yourself, Lily, but when a writer is asked to explain, like, what the purpose is, what they're trying to get across, I at least I'm kind of tongue-tied because I'm just trying to make my characters real, and whatever that's worth. So,
yeah. I make up a bunch of stuff after I've written a book to stay on book tour.
Yeah, I know. I feel like, I guess because we spend our lives making up stories, I should be better at making up stuff about the book, but I'm really bad for whatever reason.
You make up a lot of stuff just to stay on book tour.
You're going to get into trouble now.
I love that. Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Okay, so we do have some questions. Can you talk about the research you did on Spence's condition and whether you interviewed couples struggling with one of the partners having memory problems, dementia, etc.?
So, I mentioned before that I'm Sarah, but part of me sort of wishes he was Arlo. So my dad was like a really sort of traditional academic, and I was headed on a similar path. I studied political theory in college, and I was probably going to get a PhD in political theory, but I moved out to Berkeley, and a number of things happened, and I ended up writing fiction. But I say that all by saying that I think I'd have been a horrible PhD student because I'm a really lazy researcher. I'm curious to ask you this, Lily, about how much research you did on Margaret Mead, et cetera, for your second to last book. I've never written a book that I had to do a lot of research for. I'm a lazy researcher. I kind of check Google Maps to make sure I get the street names right. So in this particular case, unfortunately, I didn't need to do research because I had my father's experience, and And then I had my imagination. I mean, I did talk to a neurologist. I have a friend from college who's a neurologist at Columbia, just to get details right about, about drug trials and things like that. But that was very, very late in the game. And this is one thing we actually haven't talked about, but does feel really important to me about the book. And for this too, my life was the research, is that Ginny, the caregiver in the book, is a really important character to me. And I was just interested in that relationship, because, I mean, not to go into it in too much detail, but, often what happens in these situations is that the people who are sick and the partner of the person who's sick are a lot wealthier. Not often, they're always wealthier than their employee, but they're also desperate, and there is a temptation to feel like the caregiver is a member of the family, but they're not. They're a paid employee. In this case, Ginny has her own family. She has a son whom she has her own aspirations for. And I think those relationships are very complicated. They have, there are a lot of class issues. There are often a lot of race issues. And I think it's such an interesting relationship to write about in fiction. And I really borrowed a lot from my father's decline, when my mother was, taking care of him, but she also was going to work, and he had full-time care at home. And, I think, when you're writing about family, you're always writing about people who have a history together. Whereas when you're writing about a caregiver, the jump from total stranger to total intimate is so quick and abrupt. It's an unusual relationship. And there's also a scene that's no longer in the book but that captures something that I think is really interesting about that relationship, which is there was a scene in which Spence called out and Prue goes back to take care of him. And he says, "No, I want Ginny. Ginny's the caregiver." And I think that's both a heartbreaking moment for Prue, because he prefers the caregiver to her in that moment. But I think it's also liberating for her, because, Ginny gives her some space to have her own life. And I think that the complexities of that relationship are really so compelling. And obviously I'm digressing from your question, but this is just a way of saying that, like, a lot of the research in the book was just from what I know from life and, imagining things. I would like to be a writer who does more research, but I'm not.
So here's a question for both of you. Can you share with us a little bit about what your lives have been like during the pandemic?
Lily, you want to give that a oral?
Sure. Thank you for asking. I feel like I am not a writer who was inspired to hunker down and write the next novel in 15 months of the pandemic. I'm kind of the opposite. I found it. It's just so hard to talk about the pandemic. So many people were dying so quickly, and we had a president who was out of control, and certainly not trying to control the pandemic in any way. And so it was deeply disturbing to me. And then in the middle of it, my daughter got Lyme disease, and she's had it for 11 months. And so I actually really related a lot to Prue and the caregiving, because I feel like that has been my life. And so there's been the pandemic, and then there's been the Lyme disease, and they kind of have, one came because of the other. She was supposed to be doing something entirely different, not working on a farm in Maine. And so I have found it incredibly difficult time, and I sympathize with everybody else who's had that experience. And I think we all just need to really give ourselves a big break, and move on slowly from here.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. I'm very, very sorry about your daughter. I've often thought about that question of, like, while COVID was taking place, there were still other people getting sick from other things, and what that's like to sort of, like, to not have the disease of the moment.
Yeah.
And that seems hard and poignant and things like that. And your book. Pardon me?
I was going to say it was just hard for her to see a doctor with a fever because, everybody was like, go away, you have COVID. And, she didn't. And yet she had a fever and she was sick and she needed to be treated. It did make it difficult.
Totally crazy. And you also, your book came out right before COVID, or like, wait, is that right?
Yeah, about a week and a half. It came out March 3rd, 2020.
So that must have been weird.
It was weird. I mean, there were silver linings. My kids were away in college. They all came back, and I didn't have to go on a 3-month book tour. So it was, there were definitely silver linings at the beginning for me. To be here with my family was a really great thing, especially during that time.
Yeah, one of the silver linings has also just been these conversations, the people that you can bring together to talk about books and to keep that conversation going. So that has definitely been a silver lining. But I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter.
Thank you.
Has she improved at all?
It's really, really up and down. She's on a new medicine that is just knocking her out right now. But that's because the doctor's like, great, that's great, and so
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Someone who worked very closely with me at Books and Books years ago was my assistant, got Lyme disease. And she recovered, but it was a very long haul, and they did not even know what it was at the time. She just had partial paralysis of her face, and but now she's thriving. She's had children. She's doing great. So there, I hope that for your daughter. Okay, so one more question before we go. This one is about being the number one indie next pick and what it means to you. And I guess maybe this is a moment that you can talk about what independent bookstores mean to you.
Yeah, that's a real softball question, and I love it for that. So, and actually sort of relates to the COVID question too. I mean, my whole family, my wife and I and our 2 daughters, we all had COVID. We were in New York in March, where no one knew better. And my wife was actually, she's doing okay, but she was a long hauler, and so she was kind of like, she was getting these weird symptoms. And she was never hospitalized. But it was sort of like she was getting all these. This does relate to independent bookstores, I'll say in a second. But she was getting all these weird symptoms before anyone knew that they were COVID symptoms. She'd be like, I can't taste or smell anything. I'm going crazy. And then it'd be like 3 weeks later, it'd be reported in the Times. But in any case, so I had in a more trivial sense, I had the weird experience with COVID is that this book was supposed to come out in June 2020, and Knopf pushed it off for a year. So I had this weird period of like an extra year. The book was totally ready to go. But there are a few really great things about the delay. I'm thrilled with the delay. But probably the greatest thing with the delay was just the number of independent booksellers I got to meet through email, through various ways. I can't say enough about what it's meant to me. I mean, yes, it's great to be chosen number one. I'm not going to deny that. But to me, what's more fundamental is that to have the support of the people, you want to be loved by the people you love. And I feel like independent booksellers are what's keeping, literature, what's keeping books, keeping writers like Lily and me alive. It's a labor of love. It's a hard labor. My brother worked in an independent bookstore. I spent so much time in independent bookstores. I should have drawn a salary, but since I wasn't working there, I didn't get to draw a salary. Mm-hmm. But I just feel like to be able to go into a place like Books and Books, or really any independent bookstore, and to have someone who knows your taste, who says, this is a book that I think you would like, who understand that books are not widgets. I really feel that independent booksellers are doing heroes' work, and that we as writers and readers owe them a huge amount. So for me, the greatest thing about the greatest silver lining about COVID was a chance to meet really hundreds of independent booksellers, and I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah, I need to echo that too, because my book tour became, a virtual book tour overnight, and independent booksellers just like on a dime just spun around and became, technicians and videographers, and it happened so quickly and so instantly and so smoothly. And I just had this, this whole spring and summer and fall of just, having conversations like this with people I would never have met in real life, and so many opportunities. And the booksellers were just extraordinary in their adaptability in the face of, a huge crisis, and shutting their doors and not knowing how they were going to, continue on. And it's really, really, really been extraordinary. So.
Yeah, it was intense for sure. And I don't know about smoothly. But we definitely made the change, along with all the terror that accompanies, live events. But thank you so much for those very kind words. I loved the section that you read about the bookstore. I was laughing my head off. We love you right back. And we are a weird tribe. Yes, we're true believers. So thank you for joining us in our virtual bookshop. I hope we're going to see you at some point in a real life one, but this is wonderful. And I just want to thank you for joining us. And I want to thank everyone that's watching from everywhere. Remember, you can order your copy of the book with a green button. We'll ship it right off to you. Aha, there you go. Beautiful cover.
So trust me.
Yeah, and do that right away. And if you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores, we have them there too. So thank you, and be well, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you so much, Lily. It's a real honor to be able to talk to you. I love your work.
Well,
if you've not bought Lily's books, you absolutely have to. So, in any case, thank you so much.
And we are monkey banana people for sure.
Great. Well, we want as many monkey banana people as possible.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Take care.